Hello, everyone. I would like to thank warmly Vasiliki Chrysanthopoulos for inviting me to participate in this conference. I would also like to thank her as well as Tamsin Gilbert and Philip Cope, who put together such a great event under particularly difficult circumstances. And special thanks go, of course, to Elizabeth Costa for all her precious help with the practicalities of the recording. So, since the 1980s, in various disciplines such as archaeology, anthropology, and modern Greek studies, a thriving bibliographical universe has been devoted to the difficult relationship between modern Greeks and their ancient heritage, the politics of classical antiquity, and the ideological motivations shaping its central role in Greece and in the West. This literature has covered a number of issues highlighting the paradoxes and contestations that arise from the positioning of classical Greek antiquity as a simultaneously local, national, and global heritage, and its implication in unequal power relationships. The prioritization of the ancient Greek past over other Greek pasts in the construction of the Greek present, the protective and empowering roles the classical past has assumed in Greek contestations internationally, as well as its haunting presence in everyday life ever since the establishment of the modern Greek state. And while these issues have been extensively explored by and continue to preoccupy archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and scholars working between disciplines, contemporary art has also developed an interest in these matters. This fact opens up a prospect of exciting encounters and interactions between scholars and visual artists who work on similar issues, as well as new paths of inquiry between theory and practice. In my talk today, I will discuss the work of some artists who have engaged with the Greek difficult heritage. In the first part, I will refer to 4 young contemporary artists in Greece who represent new approaches to Greek antiquity. In the second part, I will present the work of 2 established artists exhibited as part of the 14th edition of the International Art Institution Documenta entitled Learning from Athens in 2017. I will compare these different ways of approaching and dealing with the Greek difficult heritage as a way to reflect on the role contemporary art may play in the promotion, reproduction, contestation, or activation of the past in the present. It is commonplace to say that artistic practices are not limited to the art studio anymore. The so-called discursive turn in art, along with other turns such as the historiographical, the ethnographic, and so on, have led to the academization of education in the fine arts and of art in general, resulting in the subsequent transformation of the professional artist's profile. In addition to the artist as historian who delves into the archives, and the artist as ethnographer who conducts fieldwork, a new form of artist has also emerged, the artist as archaeologist. She or he is connected to a preoccupation of contemporary art with the past, a phenomenon which may not be new in art, but what is new is its scope, the specific historical and sociopolitical developments that have driven it, as well as the choice of themes and techniques that have accompanied it. This trend is connected with a shift in the gaze of the post-Cold War world towards the past, a reflective and deconstructive gaze, which is a consequence of the weight attributed to historical events, historical consciousness, and collective memory, especially from the 80s onwards. Similar trends and interests have also begun to emerge in the works of some contemporary Greek artists, as well as in collective projects taking place in Greece. These trends go against a long tradition in art which used to, and to a large extent still does, embrace and be inspired by dominant narratives about the ancient Greek past. Such narratives, traditionally attached to the ideal of high aesthetics in art, have been favored by and shaped Greek cultural policies that have promoted ancient Greek art, often at the expense of Greece's contemporary art. Despite and/or in reaction against such attachments to and yearning for the classical past, a new field of artistic expression has appeared over the last few decades. In this approach, the past is not sought out as a source of inspiration or imitation, as has traditionally been the case, but as a form and means of displaying resistance to and critiquing established versions of history. See, for example, visual artist Chaviara's work entitled Archaeo-stress. I have brought specimens here for you. Archaeo-stress, like anti-stress balls, is made out of polyethylene. According to the artist, I quote, "It is specifically designed for exercises of national memory restitution or management of the present political situation." End of quote. Archaeo-stress was created on the occasion of a workshop I organized with the title Archaeology, Anthropology and Contemporary Art as part of the Archaeological Dialogues Conference in Athens in 2015. Archaeo-stress was displayed in a glass case at the exhibition gallery adjacent to the conference room where the workshop took place. But it was also offered by the artist to the participants to the workshop, both academics and artists, who used it to release tension while discussing matters of ancient Greek heritage. Chaviara's work is a playful and ironic critical comment on the symbolic capital of classical antiquity, which is called upon to act as an antidote, consolation, or distraction during periods of economic, institutional, and moral crisis to support national Greek claims and objectives. In its displayed miniature form, consisting of cheap, mass-produced material, it winks at the visitor who has systematically been exposed to the ideal of the aura of the unique classical artwork. When performed by the workshop participants, it not only commented on the national obsession with the golden Greek past, but also on the academic and artistic preoccupation with these matters. In his performance Cargo, during the 2018 Athens Biennale, visual artist Panos Sklavenitis drew from the imagery of the opening ceremony of the 2004 Olympic Games, where ancient Greek cupids, Minoan goddesses and Byzantine emperors marched together in an ad hoc blend, presumably intended to celebrate national continuity. Sklavenitis employed the same stereotypical elements of the Greek heritage and extended them to include modern Greek nationalist symbols currently used amongst others by the extreme right party of Golden Dawn. His carnivalesque performance began in the premises of the 2018 Athens Biennale and continued outside when the performers, presented as members of a tribe, enacted a cargo cult worship of relics of an earlier euphoric era of the 2004 Olympic Games. They flooded out onto the streets and in their colorful and extravagant costumes were meant to stir up the everyday flow of life in public spaces. As another trickster, Sklavenitis creates performances which disobey social rules, cause turmoil, and stir up established norms. Natasa Biza's art project Plan for Planting was originally conceived as part of her master's thesis at the Athens School of Fine Arts, but it was also exhibited in various other venues thereafter. Biza's work refers to a landscaping project undertaken at the site of the ancient Athenian Agora by the American School of Classical Studies in the mid-20th century, a time of another political and economic crisis in Greece. That landscaping project took place after that school had exerted its considerable political leverage to win excavation rights over the entire neighborhood, which was eventually demolished for that reason. You see here before and after, the landscape before and after the excavation. The more general wish of the school was to reconstitute the archaeological landscape, not just through the reconstruction of its monuments, but also by restoring its ancient flora. At the entrance to the archaeological site, there is a sign promising the visitors a tour in the ancient flora of classical Athens. The native plants put there by the American school in the last century still bear their trilingual name tags from 7 decades ago. With the help of an agronomist, Biza sought and identified a wider community of plants growing there today, and many of which remain anonymous. They are not indigenous and did not exist there in antiquity, but migrated to the site, spread by birds carried on the air or through human intervention in the interim. Biza named these plants, which are considered out of place in the official narrative of the American School of Classical Studies, and she tagged them in exactly the same manner as the officially approved ancient Greek plants were labeled. Her intervention in the archaeological site was accompanied by a similar intervention in the official guidebook, available at the museum shop, outlining the history of the landscaping project. Just as she attempted to fill in the names of the anonymous plants that were absent from the official narrative of the archaeological trail, she added images and texts pointing aspects of the history of the landscaping project which had been silenced by the official guidebook. Biza's work points to the random or parasitic intruder that creeps from below to the well-designed representation of an idealized past, subtly undermining the foundations of institutions and destabilizing stereotypes that they promote. A transfer was an exhibition of works by Maria Loizidou, curated by Syragotsiara, staged at the museum and the archaeological site of the ancient cemetery of Keramikos at Athens in 2015. The exhibition unfolded along a walk with 6 stops, starting from the inside of the museum and leading out into the archaeological site. Maria Loizidou had created complex compositions consisting of weaved threads of stainless steel appearing to grow out of the earth, crawl along the ground and up and down the trees before disappearing again in the soil of the cemetery. She occasionally embroidered these compositions with silk and golden filament, which spelled out names of known and unknown people from the present and the past. One stop of the route, 2 performers were engaged in an act with no beginning and no end, during which one of the 2 knitted threads of stainless steel and the other undid the knitting. They thus created a handiwork which, in the context of the setting and the other artworks, stood as a dialogue and a reflection on the circle of life, as a process of continuous production and destruction, claim and concession. The walk around the exhibition was orchestrated by the artist and the curator, who interchangeably joined the visitors in their wanderings. They offered them a tour invested with a narrative, which was also an occasion for engagement in reflection and discussion. In this way, the artist and the curator created physical and mental webs connecting life, death, and memory, and wove together art, people, landscape, past and present time. The first 3 artworks I presented to you were conceived and materialized in different contexts and employed different aesthetic forms like humor, irony, caricature, archival research, in order to problematize or question dominant narratives about the classical past. But despite their witty, poignant approach and their critical disposition and intention, it remains an open question whether they successfully destabilize and delegitimize the symbols they set out to criticize, mock, and reject, and whether the laughter some of them stir acts subversively on these occasions. In contrast to these artworks, a transfer did not proceed from a premise aimed to reject, condemn, or even criticize dominant narratives about classical antiquity, but from a wish to activate rather than represent the ancient side in a way which did not reproduce stereotypes. In doing so, it also proved successful in discreetly subverting dominant ideologies and nationalist stereotypes and shifting attention from the monumentality of classical antiquity to its social, human, and ontological experience. To these approaches to the difficult ancient Greek heritage, I would now like to juxtapose the works by two contemporary established artists who, under the auspices of the big international contemporary art exhibition Documenta 14, appealed to a wider local and international audience. Documenta 14, under the title Learning from Athens, took place in the year 2017. That was a remarkable moment in the history of Documenta, one of the art world's leading exhibitions, because for the first time in its history, it partly relocated to the Greek capital alongside its customary home in Kassel, Germany. From the terrace of the National Museum of Contemporary Art, which was one of the main venues of Documenta 14 at Athens, visitors had a direct view of a graffiti saying, "Welcome and enjoy the ruins," in letters reminiscent of the fonts Documenta 14 used in its public material. Despite the Documenta 14 artistic director's clear statement that the aim of partly staging Documenta in Athens was not related to any intent or directing the tourist gaze towards poverty in crisis-laden Athens, Documenta 14 did not escape being seen in the context of this more general interest of a politically sensitive international art world in the urban ruins of an economic crisis. But Documenta 14 did display direct interest also in ancient Greek ruins. On various occasions, the artistic director of Documenta 14 did not fail to note that the exhibition would strive to avoid invoking the overused symbolic capital of ancient Greek heritage, as well as, I quote, "the cultural clichés of bygone days and harsh everyday life," end of quote. Still, the artwork which stood out prominently and emblematically right in front of Fridericianum, Documenta's venue in Kassel, was Marta Minujin's Parthenon of books, a scale replica of the Athenian Parthenon, consisting of copies of banned books from around the world, originally conceived as a monument to the restoration of democracy in Argentina. According to the official site of Documenta 14, the Parthenon of books, I quote, "symbolizes the aesthetic and political ideas of the world's first democracy," end of quote. Thus, even though Minujin's work was meant as an anti-monument, it was still a monument, building upon and or appropriating the symbolic capital of classical Greece and emblematically invoking Athens by connecting it to its glorious present. Minujin, like all artists participating in Documenta 14, contributed to both the Athens and Kassel exhibitions. Her contribution to the Athens part was a performance entitled Payment of Greek Debt to Germany with Olives and Art, where an Angela Merkel look-alike gave a speech at the end of which she agreed to write off Greece's debt before shaking hands with the artist who offered her a handful of olives. The performance took place on the opening day of Documenta 14 in Athens, in the foyer of the National Museum of Contemporary Art, amongst works and photos referring to Western colonialism. It reverberated with stereotypical binary oppositions such as Greece versus Germany, northern monetary capital versus southern agricultural wealth, perpetrators versus victims of colonialism. In an interview, Minujin stated, I quote, "I really believe that here in Greece, where 4,000 years ago the Greeks invented democracy, created the Parthenon and so many other fantastic things, and all of the Occidental culture too, that it is impossible to have a debt that you have to pay with money. It is impossible because the whole world is indebted to Greece, because their culture comes from here." End of quote. In the same interview, Minujin also referred to the importance of the Greek culinary culture, including olives, which she used in her performance, and bread, before she concluded, "Everything comes from Greece, the debt is already paid, so by doing this performance, maybe people will understand this." End of quote. Documenta 14 had claimed that it wished to learn from Athens, not as from the cradle of Western civilization, but as a place where the contradictions of the contemporary world, embodied by loaded directionals like East and West, North and South, meet and clash. By repeating the metaphor of Greece as the cradle of European civilization, Minujin's performance and interview, however, put emphasis on exactly what Documenta 14 had originally claimed it was not interested in. And despite the fact that her work referred directly to contradictions within the contemporary world, this took the form of a simplistic Greece versus Germany dichotomy which Documenta 14 had allegedly been trying to avoid. Scottish artist Ross Birell organized a 100-day trans-European journey on horseback entitled The Athens Castle Ride, The Transit of Hermes, involving 5 horses and 4 experienced long-distance riders covering the 3,000 kilometers from Athens to Castle. The ride started at the pedestrian route that circles the Acropolis and passed through former war zones in the Balkans before ending in Castle. Birell's original inspiration was a Swiss teacher who traveled from Buenos Aires to Washington, D.C. and on to New York on 2 Argentinian Criollo horses back in the 1920s. He was attracted by the stamina of the horses and the epic story of the equine and human companionship across borders. Birell's contribution to the castle part of the exhibition was a 7-minute film, Criollo, alluding more clearly to this interest. But for the Athens part of the exhibition, it looked like the performance had to be somehow connected with the Greek classical heritage. The public launch of the Athens Castle Ride took place at the foot of the Acropolis Hill with the participation of riders on horses who formed, and this is a quote, "a visual echo of the ancient Panathenaic festival as depicted on the Parthenon frieze." End of quote. According to the artist, the ride, led by a horse named Hermes, alluded to the ancient Greek god of the crossroads, one of the deities depicted on the Parthenon frieze, and was framed, I quote, "by the increasingly tensile architecture of the European Union, the European politics more generally, that had further exacerbated the plight of those refugees fleeing Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan, among other war zones." End of quote. Even though in his inaugural speech of the Documenta 14, even though in his inaugural speech of the Documenta 14 artistic director decidedly avoided connecting the performance with the ancient Greek heritage or making any reference to indigeneity by emphasizing that the transit of Hermes was a physical act before it becomes a metaphor or allegory, participants in the art project made extended reference to Greek mythology, to the Acropolis as a symbol of humanity, and to, I quote, the purely Greek origins of Hermes' race, end of quote. None of the Documenta 14 members expressed any objection to that stance. Perhaps Documenta 14 had to turn a blind eye to the official narratives adopted by those parts of the public sector, such as the Greek Central Archaeological Committee and the Greek Ministry of Culture, with which it collaborated and on which it depended for permits, the use of sites, and so on. Or perhaps Documenta 14 did not think it right to impose any predefined reading of the artwork. However, this approach, along with the choice of the lead horse's name and the allusion to the Panathenaic festival and the Parthenon frieze, seem to indicate that once an artwork is meant to be associated with Athens, it is hard to deviate from established symbols and official narratives about classical Greece, despite expressed intentions to the contrary. The last three Documenta 14 works I presented here come to critically comment on big issues such as censorship, democracy, refugees. Such criticism may become more powerful once presented in the name of or in the vicinity of the ancient Greek topos, but it also remains safe in the sense that nothing is at stake when big symbols are used to comment on concepts which remain as generic as the means employed to approach them. Classical antiquity continues to act as a yardstick for social behavior, an eye that dictates what is wrong and what is right, and upon which social actors and phenomena are judged. These works preserve an awe towards antiquity while leaving the canonized discourse about classical antiquity fundamentally unchallenged. In juxtaposing the different artworks I presented to you, I have attempted to highlight the different ways in which the basic difficulty that results from an idealized, generalized, and ideologized representation of antiquity is managed, and to record how trends in institutions of contemporary art, as well as individual artists, are tested by such a difficulty. Political theorist Chantal Mouffe has pointed to the idea of artworks as a means to help us critically approach stereotypes and the process of their formation. On the other hand, in his seminal work, Art and Agency, anthropologist Alfred Gell introduced the idea of art as a form of social action intended to change the world rather than encode symbolic propositions about it. The artworks I have presented here invite us to reflect on the role contemporary art is asked to play and plays in the promotion, reproduction, contestation, or activation of the past in the present, its ability to act in a subversive manner disturbing the mainstream and rendering classical heritage less difficult for contemporary Athenians to live with. Thank you very much.